Welcome to History to Relax, where you can rest, breathe deeply, and drift into the past one quiet step at a time. Tonight's story is about how the United States became a global superpower. We'll travel together through geography, industry, war, culture, and the long path that shaped America's rise. The pace will be calm, the details rich, and the journey designed to help you unwind while still learning something meaningful. If you enjoy these peaceful explorations of history, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you'll know when new journeys are released. And if a particular moment or detail stands out to you, feel free to leave a message in the comments. I'd love to know what part of the story spoke to you most. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and allow the story to guide you gently through time. The tale begins now. Part 1. Geography as Destiny. When we think of why the United States became a global superpower, it is tempting to begin with wars, with industry, or with the rise of its mighty economy. Yet, before the factories hummed and before the armies marched, there was something older, something written into the very soil and shape of the land itself. Geography, the silent hand that shapes the destiny of nations. The United States was born upon a continent unlike any other. To the east, the vast Atlantic Ocean separated it from Europe, acting as both a barrier against invasion and a highway for trade. To the west, the Pacific stretched endlessly, shielding it from Asia while opening another future frontier. To the north and south, relatively weak neighbors, Canada and Mexico, meant no rival empires pressed constantly at its borders. Unlike Europe, with its crowded nations forever clashing, the United States grew in a space where geography allowed both safety and expansion. Imagine yourself standing upon the eastern seaboard in the late 18th century. Behind you lie fertile river valleys, forests stretching farther than the eye can see, and mountain chains that are impressive yet not impassable. Before you lies the Atlantic, dotted with sails of merchants carrying tobacco, wheat, and timber to old world markets. The rivers are highways in themselves, the Hudson, the Delaware, the James, flowing gently toward the sea. Each of them a natural artery through which commerce and communication can flow. As settlers pressed westward, they encountered the Appalachians, a rugged wall of stone. But even these mountains, though challenging, did not bar expansion. Beyond them opened the rolling fields of the Ohio River Valley and eventually the boundless plains. These lands were rich with soil so dark and deep that it could feed generations. It is here that America's greatest advantage lay, the sheer abundance of fertile farmland. While Europe fought bitter wars over limited territory, American settlers found themselves upon a continent that seemed to offer endless space. The Mississippi River became a spine running north to south, gathering waters from tributaries that spanned half the continent. From the Missouri in the west to the Ohio in the east, rivers poured their wealth into the Mississippi, flowing finally into the Gulf of Mexico. This river system meant that goods produced deep in the interior could be transported to the sea cheaply and efficiently. In a world where moving grain by horse cart over poor roads cost fortunes, America's rivers created a superhighway before railroads ever existed. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 secured this heartland, giving the young republic control of the Mississippi's mouth at New Orleans. With it, America had locked in its future as an agricultural giant. Grain from the Midwest could feed not only its own people but the hungry mouths of Europe. Cotton from the South, shipped down the river and out through New Orleans, would clothe the world's factories. Geography had made this possible, a continental empire joined by water. To the west lay another barrier, the Rocky Mountains. Unlike the gentle Appalachians, these peaks were formidable, snow-capped walls stretching from Canada to Mexico. Yet beyond them lay the Great Basin, the deserts, and finally the fertile valleys of California. Here, Geography played another trick. On the Pacific coast, deep water ports like San Francisco and Los Angeles would one day open the United States to trade with Asia. With control of two great oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific, America was positioned like no other nation to dominate global commerce once it had the strength to seize it. Natural resources added to this blessing. Beneath the soil lay iron ore, coal, copper, and later oil, the very fuels of modern industry. In Pennsylvania, seams of coal stretched for miles, black rock that could power steam engines and steel furnaces. In Minnesota, vast deposits of iron ore lay waiting for the steel mills of Pittsburgh and Chicago. In Texas and Oklahoma, oil would one day gush forth, fueling cars, planes, and armies. The United States had within its own borders the raw materials that other nations fought wars to acquire. Climate, too, favored American growth. The temperate zones of the eastern and central United States allowed for long growing seasons. Corn in the Midwest, wheat on the plains, tobacco in the south, each region specialized, yet together they created abundance. This agricultural surplus meant food security, population growth, and exports that filled the treasury. A nation that can feed itself is strong. A nation that can feed others becomes powerful. Then there is the sheer scale of the land. By the mid-19th century, the United States spanned from ocean to ocean, a continental empire with no equal save perhaps Russia. But where Russia's vastness was divided by frozen tundra and harsh climates, America's interior was largely habitable, arable, and connected by rivers. Settlers could spread, towns could grow, railroads could knit together the spaces. This continental unity was rare in world history. Safety also played a crucial role. Protected by oceans, the United States never faced constant invasion from powerful neighbors as France did from Germany or China from the steppe. Once Britain was expelled after the War of 1812, the young republic could develop in relative peace. Its wars were largely internal, against native nations, against Mexico, and tragically against itself during the Civil War. But unlike Europe, where great powers waged wars that devastated entire regions, America had the luxury of distance. By the time it emerged onto the world stage in the 20th century, it had grown behind the shield of geography, unscathed while rivals exhausted themselves. Consider World War I. While Europe's fields turned to mud and ruin, America's farms kept producing. While European cities endured bombardment, American cities thrived untouched. The Atlantic carried soldiers and supplies across, but when the war ended, Europe was scarred and weary while the United States was still fresh, its homeland intact. Geography had preserved its strength. And again in World War II. From London to Stalingrad, cities lay in ruins, factories shattered, populations drained. But across the Atlantic, America's factories roared at full capacity, safe beneath the ocean's shield. Planes, ships, tanks, produced in numbers no enemy could match, streamed outward. When the dust settled in 1945, the United States was the only major power whose industry was not only intact but expanded. Geography had once more ensured its rise. It is important to see that this was not merely luck. The land itself gave opportunities, but it was people who seized them. Settlers built canals and railroads to link rivers. Farmers plowed the fertile soil and shipped grain downriver. Miners dug into the earth to bring forth coal and iron. Inventors harnessed waterfalls to power mills. A vast, resource-rich land was necessary, but it was human energy that turned geography into destiny. Let us pause to imagine these scenes. The Mississippi at dawn, barges heavy with grain drifting south, mist curling over the water. Coal miners emerging from dark shafts in Pennsylvania, their faces black with dust, carrying the fuel that would power the new age. Immigrant workers laying tracks across the plains, linking the Atlantic with the Pacific. Cotton fields stretching white under the southern sun, their fibers bound for factories abroad. Each image a piece of geography transformed into power. Geography also shaped America's sense of identity. With space seemingly endless, Americans grew used to thinking of expansion as natural, the frontier spirit. The land itself seemed to whisper that limits did not exist. This confidence, born of geography, would carry into foreign policy. If the nation could stretch from ocean to ocean, why not project influence across the seas as well? By the 20th century, the United States had assembled all the geographical advantages necessary for global power. A vast and fertile land, immense natural resources, protective oceans, and access to two great markets, Europe and Asia. When the moment came, when war and crisis weakened others, America's geography ensured that it would emerge strong, united, and rich. Thus we see that the rise of the United States was not an accident of politics alone, nor the work of leaders alone. It was the land itself, the rivers, the fields, the mountains, and the oceans, that first set the stage. Geography gave America a shield, a granary, a workshop, and two great doorways to the world. All else would build upon this foundation. And so, when we ask why the United States became a global superpower, we begin here, with the quiet, unchanging truths of its land. For in every factory whistle, every grain shipment, every ship that sailed from New York or San Francisco, there was the echo of rivers and mountains, of coal seams and wheat fields. Geography had written the opening chapter of America's rise. Part 2. A Nation Apart. When the United States declared its independence in 1776, it was not yet obvious that this young republic would one day dominate the globe. It was fragile, divided, and uncertain. Yet, one of its greatest advantages was not just geography, but circumstance. For much of its early history, the United States was, in many ways, a nation apart. Unlike Europe, with its tangled borders and ancient rivalries, America had the fortune of distance. The Atlantic Ocean was more than 3,000 miles wide, a vast moat that separated the new republic from the intrigues, monarchies, and armies of the Old World. To the west lay another ocean, stretching even farther, isolating America from Asia. In this space between seas, the United States could develop in relative security. This separation mattered deeply. While Britain and France bled themselves in endless wars, the United States was free to focus on internal growth. While German states clashed and Russian czars expanded across Asia, America built farms, towns, and industries. Its people could argue fiercely among themselves, and they did, yet those arguments unfolded without the constant threat of foreign invasion. The Founding Fathers understood this gift. George Washington, in his famous farewell address, warned against entangling alliances. The young nation could not afford to be drawn into Europe's quarrels. Better, he argued, to remain neutral, to trade with all, but to fight in none. This philosophy of isolationism became a guiding principle for generations. Imagine the mindset of an American farmer in the early 19th century. His fields stretch wide under the sun. His crops will travel by riverboat to New Orleans, perhaps cross the Atlantic to feed Europeans. Yet the wars of Europe feel far away, their cannons echoing faintly across the ocean. In his world, safety and opportunity come first. Why send sons to die in quarrels of kings when there is land to till, forests to clear, and fortunes to build at home? This sense of separation gave the United States time. Time to heal after independence. Time to experiment with democracy. Time to expand across its continent without fear of hostile empires crushing it. While Europe rebuilt after Napoleonic Wars, America looked westward. While European monarchs feared revolutions, America encouraged settlement, immigration, and growth. It was not a perfect peace. The young republic fought wars on its own continent, against Britain again in 1812, against Mexico in the 1840s, and, most tragically, against itself in the Civil War. Native peoples resisted expansion fiercely, leading to decades of brutal conflict. Yet, these wars, destructive as they were, remained regional. No hostile army from across the sea ever swept into Washington or New York to occupy them. For America, the oceans were walls that allowed mistakes, recovery, and progress. This isolation also shaped American identity. From the beginning, the Republic saw itself as different from the Old World. Americans believed they were building something new, a land of opportunity, a land free from aristocracy, a land that could stand apart. The frontier experience reinforced this. As settlers moved westward, they saw endless space and believed destiny itself was on their side. Consider the year 1823, when President James Monroe issued what would become known as the Monroe Doctrine. It declared that the Western Hemisphere was no longer open for European colonization and that any attempt to extend European power would be seen as a threat to the United States. At the time, America did not yet have the military strength to enforce such a bold statement. Yet, geography and circumstance made it possible. European empires, exhausted after years of Napoleonic wars, had little appetite for new battles across the sea. The Atlantic was a wide barrier, and the US could assert a sphere of influence largely because of its distance from European power centers. For much of the 19th century, the United States remained content to look inward. Its greatest struggles were domestic: the expansion of slavery, the fate of native peoples, the forging of a continental nation. Foreign wars were brief and distant compared to the century-long rivalries of Europe. Even the Civil War, which tore the country apart, did not invite European invasion. Britain and France watched with interest, sometimes with sympathy for the Confederacy, but the ocean kept them at bay. Isolation did not mean ignorance. Americans read European newspapers, traded in European markets, and drew immigrants from European ports. But the safety of distance allowed America to pick and choose when to involve itself. It could grow wealthy from trade while avoiding the devastating costs of war. It could learn from European industry while avoiding the bloodshed of continental conflict. By the late 19th century, as railroads spanned the continent and cities swelled with industry, America's separation began to look like strength. While Europe's great powers balanced against each other, America built quietly in the background. When it finally chose to step into the world stage, it did so as a nation that had matured without being broken by foreign invasion. This stance of being apart lasted longer than many realize. Even after victory in the Spanish-American War gave the United States overseas territories, many Americans remained wary of foreign entanglements. When World War I erupted in 1914, the US stayed out for 3 years, reluctant to sacrifice lives in Europe's quarrels. Only when German submarines threatened American ships and when the war seemed at a tipping point did the nation intervene. And when it did intervene, the impact was decisive. Because America had been apart, its armies were fresh, its resources untapped, its economy unscarred by years of war. Soldiers marched to the front with new uniforms and full supplies. Factories at home produced weapons, food, and materials at levels exhausted Europe could not match. The distance that once kept America neutral now allowed it to tip the balance of power. The same pattern repeated in World War II. Once again, America hesitated, preferring to remain apart as Europe collapsed into chaos. Once again, oceans shielded its homeland from destruction. But when America did enter, its untouched factories, its secure farmland, and its protected people made all the difference. By war's end, while cities across Europe and Asia lay in ruins, the United States stood tall, its homeland intact, its economy stronger than ever. This was the great paradox of America's apartness. For decades, it had seemed like caution, even weakness, a refusal to play the game of great powers. But when the moment came, it became clear that by standing apart, America had preserved its strength while others had spent theirs. The oceans that once kept America distant had in fact kept it safe, and safety gave it time to build the foundations of superpower status. Let us imagine again. A New York harbor in the 1920s. Immigrant ships arrive daily, their passengers weary but hopeful. The skyline rises in steel and glass. Across the Atlantic, Europe rebuilds from war, its villages scarred, its fields pocked with trenches. But here, across the ocean, life surges forward, unbroken by foreign bombs. The city's noise, the hum of construction, the chatter in dozens of languages, all of it possible because America was apart, safe behind its ocean walls. Or picture the Midwest in 1943. A factory town where women and men work side by side, turning out tanks, planes, and rifles. Children collect scrap metal. The war is real, but it is far away. The factories roar without fear of bombing raids. Trains carry supplies not to ruined cities but to ports, where they will be shipped abroad. America is engaged, yes, but its homeland is safe, its people secure. The nation apart has become the arsenal for the world. This sense of being apart did not vanish easily. After World War II, even as America took up global responsibilities, many citizens longed to retreat again into isolation. But by then, it was too late. The very safety that had allowed America to grow had also made it indispensable. The oceans that once kept it separate now connected it to global trade, global security, and global responsibility. Thus, a nation apart is not just a phase of American history. It is one of the reasons it could rise to superpower status. While others exhausted themselves in endless wars, America conserved its strength. While others rebuilt, America expanded. By the time it entered the fray, it had more soldiers, more supplies, more energy to give. And when the wars ended, it was America, untouched at home, that emerged ready to lead. In this way, the United States apartness was never true isolation. It was a shield, a pause, a gift of time. Geography gave it safety, but policy gave it patience. And in that patience, the seeds of power grew. Part 3. Engines of Growth. If geography gave the United States its foundation, and if distance kept it safe while it grew, then it was industry, the engines of growth, that transformed the young nation into a force that could shape the world. For in the 19th century, the United States was not simply a country expanding across a continent. It was a country learning to harness energy, labor, and invention on a scale history had rarely seen. The story of America's rise to industrial power begins with steam. In the early 1800s, rivers still carried goods slowly to market, but the arrival of the steamboat changed everything. Now vessels could push upstream against the current, linking farms and cities with greater speed. Factories no longer had to cluster only along waterfalls for power. They could spread as new machines ran on steam engines fueled by coal. Coal, that black rock from the earth, was the hidden treasure beneath Pennsylvania's hills. Miners dug it out with aching hands, loading carts that rattled down dark shafts. Above ground, trains carried it eastward to cities and westward to expanding towns. Each ton of coal burned in a furnace was another spark in the transformation of America. It powered locomotives, lit lamps, and, most importantly, fueled the blast furnaces that smelted iron. Iron soon gave way to steel. In Pittsburgh, a smoky city along the rivers, great mills rose, belching fire and smoke. The Bessemer process allowed molten iron to be transformed into steel stronger than anything before. This steel built bridges that spanned mighty rivers, railroads that stitched together the continent, and skyscrapers that began to pierce city skylines. America's growth was not just outward across the land, but upward into the sky. Railroads were the veins and arteries of this new economy. By the mid-19th century, lines crisscrossed the eastern states, linking ports to inland towns. In 1869, the Golden Spike was driven at Promontory Summit, Utah, completing the first transcontinental railroad. Now, from New York to San Francisco, a journey that once took months by wagon could be completed in a week by train. Cattle from Texas, wheat from Kansas, and lumber from Oregon could all reach eastern markets. Immigrants, settlers, and entrepreneurs could pour westward. The iron rails tied the nation into one economic body. Along these rails ran not just goods, but dreams. Imagine the sound of a locomotive in the 1880s, its whistle echoing across the plains. Boxcars rattling, filled with grain or coal. Passenger cars rocking as families moved toward new lives. Towns sprang up along the tracks, each stop a seed that could grow into a city. The railroad was not merely transportation, it was transformation. Industry fed upon itself. Steel made railroads, and railroads carried steel. Coal powered trains, and trains carried coal. Oil, discovered in Pennsylvania in 1859, became another vital fuel. At first used for lamps, oil soon found greater purpose as engines evolved. Companies like Standard Oil, under the ruthless efficiency of John D. Rockefeller, built monopolies that could dictate prices and crush rivals. These robber barons of industry, Rockefeller in oil, Carnegie in steel, Vanderbilt in railroads, became symbols of both the power and the inequality of the age. The United States was not alone in industrializing. Britain had led the way, and Germany and France followed. But America had something unique: scale. Its vast population, swelled by waves of immigrants, provided endless labor. Its huge interior, rich with resources, supplied raw materials. Its expanding rail network created a national market where goods could be sold from coast to coast. No European country had the same combination of size, resources, and mobility. Cities exploded in size. New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Detroit, each became a hub of industry. The air filled with smoke, the streets with noise. Immigrants lived in crowded tenements, working long hours in dangerous factories. Yet even amid hardship, opportunity beckoned. Wages in America were often higher than in Europe, and the promise of upward mobility was real. The factory floor was harsh, but for millions it was still better than the fields they had left behind. Innovation kept pushing the engines forward. Telegraph wires spread across the nation, carrying news in moments instead of weeks. The telephone, invented by Alexander Graham Bell, made voice communication possible over long distances. Thomas Edison's light bulb turned night into day, allowing factories to run longer and cities to glow after sunset. Henry Ford's assembly line in the early 20th century revolutionized production, turning out automobiles that ordinary Americans could afford. Each invention multiplied the speed and scale of growth. By 1900, the United States had surpassed Britain to become the world's largest economy. Its factories produced more steel than any other nation. Its railroads spanned more miles than those of all of Europe combined. Its farms exported wheat and corn to feed the world. Its oil-fueled lamps from Buenos Aires to Berlin. America had become not just a participant in the global economy, but its engine. Let us pause to picture a day in this new industrial America. A worker in Chicago, his lunch pail in hand, steps into a factory where machines roar louder than voices. He spends 12 hours tending a machine press, each clang another piece of steel shaped for railroads or bridges. At night, he walks home past tenements crowded with families from Ireland, Italy, Poland, and beyond. Children play in narrow alleys, their laughter mixing with the rattle of streetcars. Above it all, smokestacks glow with fire, their plumes drifting into the sky. Meanwhile, far away in the countryside, a farmer harnesses a steel plow drawn by horses. With the new machinery, he can till fields once thought too vast for a single family. Grain pours from his harvest, filling train cars bound for cities or ships. His labor, multiplied by machines, feeds millions not just in America but across the Atlantic. This industrial might had profound consequences for America's place in the world. It gave the nation wealth, which in turn built navies, funded expansion, and attracted immigrants. It gave the nation confidence, a belief that progress was unstoppable, that American ingenuity could solve any problem. It also gave the nation power, the kind that could tip the balance in global affairs. When wars erupted overseas, America had the capacity to supply allies or, if it chose, to intervene directly. But these engines of growth also created challenges. Wealth was unevenly distributed. Workers toiled in unsafe conditions. Strikes and labor movements erupted, demanding fair wages and hours. The very scale of industry created monopolies that frightened even government leaders. Yet even these struggles were signs of vitality, a nation grappling with modernity, not crushed by it. For the world, America's industrial growth was impossible to ignore. By the dawn of the 20th century, ships leaving New York carried manufactured goods to every corner of the globe. American companies invested abroad. American inventions reshaped daily life far beyond its borders. The United States had begun to export not only goods but also influence, laying the groundwork for the cultural and economic dominance that would come later. Industry was not the only measure of growth, but it was the clearest. The United States had moved in a single century from a nation of farmers and frontier towns to a nation of steel, oil, and electricity. The hum of machines had become its heartbeat, and with that hum came the ability to project power far beyond its shores. Thus, the engines of growth were more than economic. They were strategic. Industrial power meant military power. It meant ships could be built, weapons manufactured, armies supplied. When the 20th century brought global wars, the United States would discover that its factories were as vital as its soldiers. The arsenal that won those wars was forged long before, in the mills of Pittsburgh, the refineries of Pennsylvania, and the assembly lines of Detroit. Part 4. People of many lands. If coal, steel, and oil were the raw materials of America's industrial might, then people were the living force that transformed those materials into power. The United States did not rise to greatness through resources alone, but through the hands, minds, and determination of millions who came from every corner of the earth. Immigration, diversity, and the constant renewal of labor and ideas became one of the greatest engines behind America's rise to superpower status. From its earliest days, America was a land of many peoples. The original colonies had already drawn migrants from England, Scotland, Ireland, the Netherlands, Germany, and Africa, some free, others enslaved. But in the 19th and early 20th centuries, immigration surged to levels the world had rarely seen. Ships arriving in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and later San Francisco carried wave after wave of humanity, seeking work, freedom, or simply survival. Picture Ellis Island in the 1890s. Crowds stream down gangplanks, clutching bundles of belongings. Families wait nervously as inspectors ask questions in languages they barely understand. Children cling to their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed at the sight of the great city skyline beyond. For many, this was the first step into an unknown life. They came from Ireland, fleeing famine. From Germany, seeking opportunity. From Italy and Poland, escaping poverty. From Russia, fleeing persecution. Later, from Asia, through Angel Island in California, workers arrived to lay railroads and till fields. Each group brought its culture, its labor, and its dreams. The scale was staggering. Between 1880 and 1920, more than 20 million immigrants entered the United States. Cities swelled with their presence. New York became a mosaic of neighborhoods: Irish in Hell's Kitchen, Italians in Little Italy, Jews in the Lower East Side, Germans in Brooklyn. Chicago grew with Poles, Czechs, and Swedes. San Francisco filled with Chinese laborious despite laws that sought to exclude them. These immigrants did not merely add to America, they transformed it. Immigrants provided the muscle for industrial growth. They laid tracks across the continent, dug coal from dangerous mines, and worked in steel mills where furnaces roared. They stitched garments in sweatshop, rolled cigars in crowded factories, and carried bricks for endless construction. Wages were low, hours long, conditions harsh. Yet for many, even this was better than what they had left behind. And their labor was essential. Without it, the machines of American industry could not have turned so quickly or so profitably. But it was not only muscle they provided. Immigrants brought skills, ideas, and entrepreneurial spirit. German immigrants built breweries that became household names. Jewish immigrants opened shops that grew into great department stores. Inventors like Nikola Tesla, born in the Austrian Empire, brought genius that reshaped modern electricity. Scientists, artists, musicians, and writers from abroad enriched American culture and knowledge. The diversity of backgrounds created a crucible where new ideas could spark. The very clash of cultures often created innovation. In crowded neighborhoods, different traditions mingled. Foods blended. Pizza and hot dogs became American staples, born of immigrant kitchens. Music evolved. Jazz emerged from African American communities, but it absorbed European instruments and immigrant audiences. American culture was never static. It was a fusion, renewed by each wave of arrivals. Immigration also supplied the soldiers who would one day defend America abroad. In the Civil War, regiments of Irish, German, and other immigrants fought bravely. In World War I, sons of immigrants filled the ranks, proving their loyalty to their adopted homeland. The promise of citizenship and acceptance was often sealed in blood on the battlefield. By the time of World War II, America's armies were a true mosaic of peoples, united under one flag. The challenges of immigration were real. Nativist movements rose, fearing that foreigners would overwhelm American identity. Laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 sought to close doors. Immigrants often faced prejudice, discrimination, and violence. Tenements were overcrowded, sanitation poor, and diseases spread easily. Yet despite hardship, most immigrants endured, and their children often rose into new positions. Teachers, doctors, business owners, leaders. Each generation climbed higher, lifting the nation with them. Imagine an Italian stonemason in New York, chipping granite for a new bridge. His son becomes a construction foreman. His grandson, a college student, studies engineering. Within 3 generations, the family has risen from poverty to prosperity. This pattern repeated millions of times, creating a social dynamism that few other nations could match. In Europe, class and tradition often limited mobility. In America, though obstacles were many, mobility was possible, and immigrants believed in it fiercely. This constant renewal of population gave America an edge. While European nations worried about shrinking farmland and overpopulation, America had space and labor to spare. Immigrants filled its cities, expanded its markets, and provided endless energy for growth. Even when one group began to assimilate and climb into the middle class, new arrivals came to take their place in the factories and workshops. The cycle ensured a steady supply of workers, dreamers, and risk-takers. The diversity of America also gave it resilience. No single famine or regional collapse could cripple it, because its people came from everywhere. When one region of Europe struggled, another sent migrants. When Asia faced upheaval, America received new workers. This mixture of origins created a society less tied to old grievances and more oriented toward the future. For all the tensions, the overall effect was a population constantly replenished with hope. Consider the sheer psychological power of this diversity. A person who has left everything behind, home, language, family, to seek a new life is often deeply motivated to succeed. America became a nation of such people, willing to endure hardship for the promise of something better. That hunger, multiplied across millions, became a driving force behind its rise. By the early 20th century, the American workforce was one of the most diverse in history. In a single factory, workers might speak a dozen languages. Children in schools grew up hearing multiple accents, learning tolerance by necessity. Over time, this blending created not just an economy, but a culture that was flexible, adaptive, and innovative. It was a culture that could absorb new ideas, mix them, and turn them into something distinctly American. Immigration also tied America to the wider world. Families sent letters and money back to Europe, Asia, and beyond. News traveled quickly through immigrant communities. When Europe went to war, Americans of German, Irish, Italian, and Slavic descent felt the pull of loyalty and heritage. This global network made America aware of events abroad long before it chose to intervene. And when it did intervene, it often did so with the knowledge that its own people had roots in the very lands now at war. Let us imagine one more scene. A Jewish family arrives in New York in 1905, fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe. They carry a few suitcases and little money. The father takes a job in a garment factory, sewing coats for long hours. The mother takes in laundry from neighbors. Their children attend crowded public schools, learning English quickly. Within a generation, the family has saved enough to open a small store. Within 2 generations, one child becomes a lawyer, another a doctor. From persecution to prosperity, the journey is complete. Multiply this by millions, and you see the story of America's rise. The United States became a superpower not just because of its land, its industry, or its isolation, but because of its people from everywhere. Immigration was not merely an addition to the nation, it was the nation's very essence. The constant infusion of labor, culture, and determination created an energy unmatched in the world. When wars came, when industries expanded, when frontiers opened, America always had the people to seize the opportunity. And not just any people, but people hardened by migration, willing to risk, eager to build. This human capital was as vital as any natural resource. It was the fuel that turned the engines of growth into a force that propelled the United States toward global power. Part 5. The Gilded Age and Beyond. By the late 19th century, The United States had already become a land transformed by geography, isolation, industry, and immigration. But in the decades following the Civil War, these forces converged in ways that created something new. Immense concentrations of wealth, corporations larger than many nations, and financial systems powerful enough to shape the world. This was the Gilded Age, an era glittering with prosperity on the surface, yet shadowed by inequality and turmoil beneath. The term Gilded Age, coined by writers Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner, captured the paradox of the time. It was an age of golden opportunity, yet also one of corruption and struggle. Railroads crisscrossed the land, skyscrapers began to rise, and fortunes grew to sizes unimaginable in earlier generations. At the same time, workers endured long hours and low pay, farmers struggled with debts, and political machines traded favors for influence. It was a time when the foundations of America's global power were laid, not only in steel and oil, but in money and finance. The icons of this era were the so-called captains of industry, or, to their critics, robber barons. Men like John D. Rockefeller in oil, Andrew Carnegie in steel, J.P. Morgan in finance, and Cornelius Vanderbilt in railroads amassed fortunes that rivaled entire governments. Rockefeller built Standard Oil into a near monopoly, controlling not only the refining of oil but its transportation and sale. His methods were ruthless, buying competitors, undercutting prices, securing secret deals with railroads. Yet his efficiency drove costs down and production up, making oil cheaper and more available than ever before. Carnegie transformed steel production through vertical integration, controlling every step from raw iron ore to finished rails and beams. His steel built bridges across the Mississippi, rails across the continent, and skyscrapers that defined modern cities. Morgan, with his calm presence and piercing eyes, wielded financial power like a general commanding an army. When railroads faltered, he reorganized them. When banks panicked, he stabilized them. In 1907, during a severe financial crisis, it was Morgan himself, not the federal government, who stepped in to coordinate rescues of banks and businesses, preventing total collapse. Vanderbilt, once a steamboat operator, became the master of railroads, linking regions and creating transportation empires. His lines connected ports, markets, and cities, moving goods and people at unprecedented speed. These men became symbols of both America's promise and its peril. They showed what ambition could achieve in a free market. They also showed how power could concentrate dangerously in the hands of a few. But regardless of moral judgment, their wealth and systems laid the groundwork for America's transformation into a global power. The Gilded Age was not just about industry. It was about the creation of financial structures that could support and expand it. Banks multiplied. Stock markets in New York grew from small exchanges to institutions where millions of dollars changed hands daily. Insurance companies, investment houses, and trusts provided the capital for railroads, factories, and mines. New York City became the beating financial heart of the nation. Its skyline of the late 19th century bristled with banks and trading houses. Telegraph wires connected it to Chicago, London, and beyond, allowing financial news and transactions to travel instantly. By the early 20th century, Wall Street was not just an American center, it was a global one. This financial power mattered. To build railroads across thousands of miles required not just steel and labor, but massive loans and investments. To fund new factories or shipping fleets required access to credit. America's growing financial system provided that, giving it the ability to expand faster than most nations. It also tied America's fate to global trade and investment, making it increasingly central to world economics. The Gilded Age was also an era of infrastructure, the bones and muscles of a modern economy. Railroads were the most visible. By 1900, more than 190,000 miles of track laced the nation, carrying coal, wheat, cattle, and people. Towns without a railroad faded. Towns with one thrived. Railroads also created standardized time zones, necessary to coordinate train schedules, which in turn unified the nation's sense of time itself. Cities grew rapidly, and with them came new systems: paved streets, saws, waterworks, electric grids. Skyscrapers, made possible by steel and elevators, redefined the urban landscape. The Brooklyn Bridge, completed in 1883, stood as a symbol of engineering might and urban ambition. In Chicago, the world's first skyscraper rose in 1885. In New York, the Statue of Liberty greeted arrivals by sea, while downtown towers housed banks, newspapers, and corporations. Infrastructure was not merely functional, it was symbolic, a visible expression of America's confidence and modernity. Yet the glitter of the Gilded Age covered deep cracks. Workers labored long hours in dangerous factories for meager wages. Child labor was common. Tenements in cities like New York were overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and disease-ridden. Strikes erupted: the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the Haymarket Affair of 1886, the Homestead Strike of 1892. Each was a battle between labor and capital, between the millions who worked and the few who owned. Farmers, too, struggled. Mechanization and falling crop prices meant many sank into debt. They formed alliances and movements, demanding fairer treatment from railroads and banks. Populist movements rose in the Midwest and South, reflecting a deep tension between rural life and urban industrial power. Politics often mirrored these divides. Corruption was rampant. Political machines like New York's Tammany Hall traded jobs and favors for votes. Senators were sometimes chosen more by bribery than by ballot. For many ordinary Americans, the system seemed rigged in favor of the wealthy. And yet, amid these struggles, progress was also born. Labor unions slowly grew in influence. Reformers fought for better housing, safer conditions, and honest government. Journalists, the muckrakers, exposed corruption and abuses, stirring public outrage. The very excesses of the Gilded Age sparked the progressive era that followed, leading to reforms in labor, antitrust laws, and politics. By the dawn of the 20th century, the United States had emerged from the Gilded Age stronger than ever. Its industries dominated global production. Its railroads tied the continent together. Its banks and stock markets financed ventures at home and abroad. Its cities were larger, taller, and more modern than those of most nations. Even the inequalities, though harsh, pointed to vitality. Unlike nations weighed down by rigid aristocracies, America was still open to mobility. A poor immigrant's child could become a millionaire industrialist. A farm boy could rise to be president. Though not all opportunities were equal, especially for women and people of color, the belief in opportunity gave America a restless, ambitious energy. Internationally, the Gilded Age made America impossible to ignore. Its steel, oil, and goods-filled world markets. Its financial systems influenced global credit. Its corporations expanded abroad. And its wealthy elite began to look beyond the continent, toward overseas investments, colonies, and markets. The Spanish-American War of 1898, which brought territories like Puerto Rico and the Philippines under American control, was as much a product of industrial and financial ambition as of politics or ideology. Imagine a bustling New York harbor around 1900. Ships docked, unloading goods from Europe and Asia. Others departed, holds filled with American wheat, steel, and machinery. On the streets above, Streetcars clanged, elevated trains roared, and buildings soared higher each year. In the banks downtown, financiers moved millions with the stroke of a pen. In the factories uptown, workers sweated over machines that turned raw materials into finished goods. The entire city pulsed with energy, a microcosm of the nation's rise. Or picture a Kansas farm, where a family harvests wheat with new mechanical reapers. The grain, loaded onto trains, travels eastward to feed the cities or to be shipped overseas. Even in the rural heartland, the rhythms of global trade are felt. A farmer in Kansas is connected to a baker in Paris or a factory in London. The world is shrinking, and America is at its center. The legacy of this era extended far beyond its years. The corporations created in the Gilded Age became some of the giants of the 20th century. The financial institutions of Wall Street grew into global powerhouses. The infrastructure built, railroads, bridges, cities, formed the backbone of a modern superpower. Just as importantly, the struggles of the era forged reforms that would make America more stable and just. Antitrust laws curbed the worst monopolies. Labor laws gradually improved working conditions. Progressive reforms cleaned up politics. By addressing its internal tensions, America made itself stronger for the challenges ahead. The Gilded Age was, in many ways, the adolescence of America's rise. It was messy, contradictory, and often unjust. Yet it was also dynamic, creative, and transformative. It turned a young, growing nation into an economic giant, preparing it for the global role it would soon assume. And so, when we ask why the United States became a superpower, we must look to these decades of gold and shadow. For it was here that corporations, finance, and infrastructure created a platform for global reach. The glitter may have been thin, but beneath it lay steel, oil, money, and ambition, the true foundations of American power. Part 6. First Steps Abroad. By the final decades of the 19th century, the United States was no longer the fragile republic of Washington and Jefferson. It had grown into a continental giant, with railroads stretching from coast to coast, cities glowing with electric light, and factories producing more steel than any other nation. The frontier, once the measure of opportunity, was declared closed. No longer could the nation define its destiny solely by pushing westward across open land. The eyes of its leaders, and increasingly its people, turned outward. If the future of America was no longer found on its own soil, then perhaps it would be found across the seas. The mood was changing. The old philosophy of isolationism, of standing apart from European quarrels, was still strong in many hearts. Yet at the same time, a new confidence stirred. Politicians spoke of America's duty to bring order and commerce to the world. Business leaders hungered for markets where their goods could be sold. Strategists looked at maps and saw coaling stations, islands, and harbors as stepping stones for a navy that might one day reach across the globe. Theories of social Darwinism, crude as they were, gave some Americans the conviction that their nation had a destiny to rise above others. The spark that set expansion alight came in 1898 with the Spanish-American War. For centuries, Spain had ruled a vast empire. By the late 19th century, little remained: Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and a scattering of islands. In Cuba, rebellion simmered. American newspapers, competing for readers, sensationalized Spanish atrocities, whipping up sympathy for the rebels and anger toward Spain. When the American battleship Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, killing over 200 sailors, public opinion demanded action. "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," became the cry. The war that followed was brief, lasting only a few months, but its consequences were immense. American forces overwhelmed Spain both in the Caribbean and in the Pacific. In Manila Bay, Admiral George Dewey's fleet destroyed the Spanish squadron with remarkable ease, announcing America's arrival as a naval power. In Cuba, young men such as Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders became national heroes. Spain, once a mighty empire, was forced to surrender. The treaty that ended the war gave the United States Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and ensured Cuban independence under American influence. For the first time, the United States controlled territories thousands of miles beyond its continental borders. The Pacific, once a distant ocean, now contained American possessions. The Caribbean, once dominated by European powers, now fell under America's watchful eye. The United States had taken its first unmistakable steps onto the global stage. This expansion was controversial. Critics argued that imperialism betrayed America's founding ideals of liberty and self-determination. Voices like Mark Twain and members of the Anti-Imperialist League warned that ruling over distant peoples would corrupt the Republic. Yet others insisted that America had both a duty and a right to project its influence. The debate itself revealed a nation struggling with its new role, caught between the tradition of isolation and the temptation of empire. While the Spanish-American War marked a turning point, it was not the only sign of America's outward gaze. In the same decade, the United States annexed Hawaii, securing a vital naval base at Pearl Harbor. American companies already dominated Hawaiian sugar, but now the islands became an official part of the expanding nation. In Asia, America joined European powers in asserting influence over China, promoting the open-door policy to ensure access to Chinese markets. In Latin America, the United States increasingly acted as the dominant power, echoing the Monroe Doctrine with more assertiveness. The building of the Panama Canal soon followed, though it came in the early 20th century under Roosevelt's presidency. By cutting a path through Central America, the canal gave the U.S. Navy and merchant ships a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific. This single project transformed global trade and military power, allowing America to move its fleets rapidly between oceans. The canal was a symbol of how engineering and ambition could extend America's reach. These first steps abroad were as much about psychology as territory. For most of the 19th century, Americans had thought of their nation as separate, a young republic safe in its own hemisphere. Now, with overseas colonies, a modern navy, and involvement in global markets, the United States could no longer pretend to be apart. It was becoming, by choice and necessity, a world power. Imagine the feeling of a sailor in 1899, stationed in Manila, half a world away from his home in Ohio or New York. He walks the streets of a city filled with languages he does not understand, palm trees swaying in the tropical air, children watching the new foreign soldiers with wide eyes. He knows that his nation has crossed a threshold. It is no longer confined to its own land. The same realization comes to a businessman in New York who now sells goods in Havana, or a farmer in Kansas whose wheat might end up feeding markets in Asia. Expansion was no longer a distant dream. It was a living reality. These moves abroad also set precedents. They showed that the United States was willing to use military power for influence. They established naval bases that would serve as springboards for future operations. They tied American prosperity not only to its own people but to the fate of territories and markets across oceans. And they forced Americans to confront new questions. What did it mean to govern distant peoples? Could a republic built on liberty also be an empire? The answers were never simple, and debates raged for decades. But one truth became clear: once America stepped onto the global stage, it would not easily retreat. Each new conflict, each new market, each new naval station made retreat less likely. The steps taken at the end of the 19th century carried momentum that would propel the nation into the 20th. When we ask why the United States became a superpower, we must remember these first steps abroad. They were small compared to what would come later, yet they were decisive. They marked the moment when America's power leapt from continent to world, when oceans became not just barriers but highways. And they revealed a nation discovering, sometimes reluctantly, that its destiny could not be contained within its own borders. Part 7. Into the Great War. For much of its history, the United States had stood apart from the wars that consumed Europe. The Atlantic was a wide buffer, and Americans often believed their destiny lay within their own borders, not in the blood-soaked fields across the ocean. Yet, in 1917, this tradition was broken. The United States entered what was then called the Great War, a conflict so vast and devastating that it seemed to swallow the old world whole. When it did, the world changed forever. For the first time, America was not just a distant observer or a trading partner, but a decisive actor on the global stage. The entry of the United States into World War I revealed to both itself and to others the true measure of its power. When war erupted in Europe in 1914, Americans were divided in both sentiment and purpose. Many felt no desire to intervene in battles between empires. Millions of immigrants had ties to the warring nations. Germans, Irish, Italians, and others read newspapers that reflected their old loyalties. The country was also far from unified in outlook. President Woodrow Wilson declared neutrality, urging Americans to remain impartial in thought as well as in action. For 3 years, the nation tried to keep its distance, trading with both sides, watching as the conflict grew into a nightmare of trenches, machine guns, and poison gas. Yet neutrality was never as simple as it seemed. American commerce increasingly favored Britain and France. Ships loaded with wheat, steel, and munitions crossed the Atlantic. German submarines, desperate to cut off this supply line, prowled the seas. When the passenger liner Lusitania was sunk by a U-boat in 1915, killing more than 100 Americans, outrage flared. Still, the nation hesitated. Wilson sought peace, even proposing to mediate an end to the conflict. But the tides of war pulled harder each year. By 1917, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, declaring that any ship approaching Britain would be a target. The risk was too great to ignore. Then came the Zimmermann telegram, a secret German message proposing an alliance with Mexico if the United States entered the war. When British intelligence revealed it to the Americans, the public was shocked. Suddenly, the threat was not only across the Atlantic but at America's southern border. The nation could no longer stand aside. In April 1917, Wilson went before Congress and asked for a declaration of war. His words framed the conflict not merely as a European struggle, but as a moral crusade. The world must be made safe for democracy. With those words, America crossed a threshold. For the first time, it would send its armies across the ocean to fight in a European war. The scale of the mobilization was immense. Within months, the United States began raising an army of millions through the draft. Training camps sprang up across the nation. Men who had never left their hometowns now prepared to cross the ocean. Farmers, clerks, teachers, and factory workers donned uniforms. At the same time, the home front shifted into motion. Factories turned out rifles, artillery, helmets, and uniforms. Shipyards built vessels to ferry troops. Women filled workplaces, while others joined the Red Cross or worked as nurses. Liberty bonds were sold in massive campaigns, financing the war effort. Imagine the scene in 1918 as ships departed New York Harbor. Soldiers crowded the decks, waving to the Statue of Liberty as bands played and families wept on the docks. These young men were crossing into a world they barely understood, heading toward trenches filled with mud, rats, and shellfire. Behind them lay a nation humming with activity, determined to supply them with everything they needed. The industrial power of the United States was now directed toward war, and its effect would be staggering. When American troops, known as the American Expeditionary Forces under General John J. Pershing, began arriving in France, the Allies were exhausted. After years of slaughter, French and British armies were bled white. German offensives threatened to break through. Morale was brittle. Into this desperate situation came fresh divisions of Americans, eager, untested, but strong. Their arrival was more than physical. It was psychological. Soldiers at the front whispered that the Yanks are coming. Civilians in Paris cheered as columns of American troops marched through their streets. The presence of the United States signaled that the tide could yet turn. In battle, the Americans proved both raw and determined. At Cantigny in May 1918, they launched their first offensive, small but symbolic, capturing the village from German forces. At Belleau Wood in June, Marines fought with ferocity, earning a reputation as devil dogs from their enemies. At Saint-Mihiel and in the Meuse-Gorne, massive American offensives rolled forward, pushing back the Germans in the final months of the war. Over 1 million American soldiers fought in the Meuse-Gorne alone, one of the largest campaigns in U.S. history. The cost was heavy. More than 100,000 Americans lost their lives, many to influenza as much as to bullets. Yet their sacrifice marked America's place among the great powers. The United States had tipped the balance. Without American troops and supplies, the Allies might not have prevailed. With them, Germany realized its position was hopeless. In November 1918, the guns fell silent. The Great War ended, leaving Europe in ruins and the United States in a position of unprecedented influence. At the peace conference in Paris, President Wilson arrived not as a minor figure but as a central voice. His 14 points outlined a vision for a new world order, one based on open diplomacy, self-determination, and a League of Nations to prevent future wars. For a brief moment, America seemed poised not only to win wars but to shape peace. Crowds cheered Wilson in the streets of Europe, treating him as a prophet of democracy and fairness. But at home, the story was different. The Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles and refused to join the League of Nations. Many Americans, weary of foreign entanglements, longed to return to isolation. The war had been a test, and though America had passed it with strength, the nation was not yet ready to assume permanent global responsibilities. The 1920s would see a retreat into domestic focus, even as American culture and finance spread abroad. Still, the war had changed everything. The United States had shown it could raise armies, project them across the ocean, and fight effectively alongside the great powers. It had shown that its industrial base could supply not only itself but its allies. It had revealed that American decisions could determine the fate of continents. Even if the nation stepped back after the war, the world could not forget what it had witnessed. Picture the aftermath in 1919. A young American soldier returns to his farm in Iowa. He has seen the trenches of France, the ruined villages, the shattered faces of survivors. He tells his neighbors that America made the difference, that when the Yanks arrived, the Germans began to falter. In New York, bankers count the profits of war loans. In Hollywood, films glorify the heroism of doughboys. Across the world, people speak of America not as a distant republic but as a decisive power. The perception had shifted permanently. The Great War, then, was not only a test of arms but a revelation of potential. It showed that the oceans were no longer barriers, that America could cross them and shape events on the other side. It showed that industry, manpower, and organization had elevated the United States to a position once held only by Europe's empires. And it foreshadowed what was to come in the even greater conflict that would erupt 2 decades later. For when we ask why the United States became a superpower, the First World War stands as a turning point. It was the moment when America stepped onto the world stage not just as a supplier or a bystander, but as a decisive participant. It was the moment when allies learned to depend on its strength, and when rivals recognized its reach. Though America would hesitate to remain deeply engaged after the war, the path was set. The Great War was America's introduction as a global actor, and once that curtain rose, it could never truly fall again. Part 8. Between Wars. The First World War had ended with silence on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. For Europe, the silence was heavy, filled with grief, ruin, and exhaustion. But across the Atlantic, the United States emerged in a different light. Its cities stood intact, its factories expanded, its fields fertile and productive. The war had announced America as a power to be reckoned with. Yet in the decades that followed, America found itself caught between 2 impulses: the urge to step back into the comfort of isolation, and the temptation to take up the mantle of leadership. Between the wars, the United States wrestled with prosperity and depression, invention and collapse, retreat and resurgence. Out of that struggle came lessons and institutions that would one day underpin its rise as the dominant global superpower. The 1920s began with a rush of energy. For many Americans, the war had been a distant thunder. Soldiers had gone, some had not returned, but the homeland had never been invaded, never bombed, never scarred the way France and Belgium had been. Instead, America's factories had profited, its banks had grown rich, its farmers had exported to a starving Europe. With peace came a sense of triumph. The nation felt young, modern, and eager to leave behind the shadow of trenches and death. The decade came to be called the Roaring Twenties, and the name was well earned. Cities glowed with electric light. Radios appeared in homes, bringing music and news instantly into kitchens and parlors. Jazz spilled from clubs in Harlem, New Orleans, and Chicago, a sound both rebellious and intoxicating. Automobiles, made cheap and plentiful by Henry Ford's assembly lines, filled streets once quiet with horses. Americans drove to work, to leisure, to the countryside, weaving the vast land together with speed and freedom. Skyscrapers rose higher in New York, symbols of ambition and confidence. Airplanes, still a novelty of the war, now carried mail and adventurous passengers, shrinking distances that once seemed vast. Economically, the United States dominated the world. By the mid-1920s, it produced nearly half of the world's industrial goods. Wall Street became not just an American financial hub, but a global one. Loans flowed to Europe, helping nations rebuild. American movies filled theaters abroad, shaping fashion, humor, and ideals. American products, from Coca-Cola to Ford automobiles, became familiar in foreign streets. The United States was not yet formally leading the world politically, but culturally and economically, it was already setting the pace. Yet beneath the glitter of prosperity lay fragility. Farmers, who had expanded production during the war to meet European demand, now found themselves facing oversupply and falling prices. Debt mounted across rural America. In cities, speculation in stocks grew feverish, fortunes made overnight in markets that seemed never to falter. Factories produced goods at a frantic pace, but wages did not always keep up, and inequality widened. The system glittered like the gold leaf of the Gilded Age, bright but thin. Then, in October 1929, the glitter cracked. The stock market collapsed, sending shockwaves through banks, businesses, and homes. What began as a financial panic spiraled into the Great Depression, the deepest economic crisis in American history. Millions lost jobs. Bread lines stretched across city blocks. Farmers watched crops rot in fields because they could not afford to harvest them. Families packed belongings into old cars, wandering in search of work. Songs and stories of the era captured the despair, the Dust Bowl storms that turned the sky black, the empty factories, the foreclosures. The Depression reshaped the nation. It tested not only the resilience of its people, but the capacity of its government. For decades, the federal government had played a limited role in the economy. Now, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal, that changed. Programs put men to work building dams, roads, and parks. Social Security was created to protect the elderly. Regulations were imposed on banks and the stock market to prevent future collapse. The government, once a distant figure in economic life, became an active participant. This shift mattered for America's future as a superpower. The Depression showed that unregulated capitalism could falter, but it also showed that democracy could adapt. Where other nations turned to dictators promising order, America turned to reform. Roosevelt's calm voice, carried by radio in his fireside chats, reassured millions that the system could be saved. Confidence, fragile but enduring, kept democracy alive at a moment when it might have crumbled. Internationally, the Depression had enormous consequences. As the American economy collapsed, so too did the loans and trade that much of Europe depended on. Germany, already burdened by reparations from the Treaty of Versailles, fell into chaos. Factories closed, unemployment soared, bitterness deepened. Out of this bitterness rose extremist movements, most fatefully, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. In this sense, the global depression was one of the direct pathways to World War II. America's fate and the world's fate were entwined more closely than many Americans wanted to admit. Through the 1930s, America's instinct was still to remain apart. Neutrality acts sought to prevent involvement in foreign wars. The memory of the Great War's carnage lingered, and most citizens wanted no repeat. Isolationism was strong, even as totalitarian regimes rose abroad. But events could not be kept distant forever. The world was changing too quickly. The period between the wars also revealed something else vital: the sheer resilience of the American people. Families learned to endure with little. Neighbors shared food. Communities built networks of survival. Migrant families moved from the Dust Bowl plains to California, enduring hardship with stubborn hope. Musicians like Woody Guthrie gave voice to the pain, but also to the persistence of ordinary people. This cultural endurance, forged in struggle, gave America a toughness that would later serve it well in war. Imagine a family in 1933, living in a small house with little heat. The father is out of work, the mother stretches meals with what little she has, the children wear patched clothes. Yet on the radio comes Roosevelt's voice, calm and steady, promising that things will improve. Outside, men work on a new dam project, their paychecks bringing life to small towns. Across the nation, similar stories played out. The Depression was cruel, but it also created a shared experience that bound the nation together. By the end of the 1930s, as war clouds gathered again in Europe, the United States had changed. It was still recovering economically, but it had built new systems of stability. Banks less likely to collapse, safety nets for the vulnerable, public works that modernized the nation. It had also learned humility. Prosperity could vanish overnight, markets could falter, but democracy could endure if it adapted. These lessons gave America a flexibility that would prove essential in the storm to come. Between the wars, then, the United States lived through extremes. The exuberance of the Roaring Twenties showed its economic and cultural dynamism. The devastation of the Great Depression showed its vulnerabilities but also its resilience. Out of these years came both caution and strength. The nation emerged scarred, yet with new institutions, new confidence in reform, and new awareness of its global connections. So when World War II erupted in 1939, America at first clung to isolation, but deep down the nation was different from the one that had hesitated in 1914. It now understood that its economy was tied to the world, that its democracy had survived crisis, and that its industry could be mobilized on a scale unmatched by any other. The years between wars were not wasted, they were formative. They prepared the United States for the role it would soon be forced to play. And so, when we ask why the United States became a superpower, the years between the wars stand as a bridge. They reveal not only prosperity and despair, but adaptation and survival. They show a nation capable of excess, capable of collapse, but also capable of renewal. Out of the roaring, out of the silence, came a strength that would be tested and proven in the greatest conflict the world had ever seen. Part 9. The Arsenal of Democracy. When war returned to Europe in 1939, Americans once again hoped distance would keep them safe. The oceans were wide, the nation weary of foreign entanglements, and memories of the Great War still sharp. But the thunder of tanks in Poland, the fall of France, and the bombing of Britain made it clear that this conflict would not remain a distant storm. Even before Pearl Harbor, the United States began to shift, slowly at first, then with growing urgency, into the role of supplier, financier, and defender of those fighting tyranny. Franklin D. Roosevelt gave it a name that would echo through history: the Arsenal of Democracy. The phrase captured something vital. America might not yet be at war, but it had the tools, the industry, and the resources to arm the nations that were. Roosevelt, speaking in December 1940, told his people that if Britain fell, the security of the United States itself would be threatened. The best way to defend democracy was to ensure that Britain and its allies had the weapons they needed to survive. And so, the gears of America's industrial might began to turn, preparing not just for self-defense, but for the defense of the free world. Factories that once made cars now rolled out tanks and jeeps. Shipyards that once built freighters now launched destroyers and aircraft carriers. Aircraft plants multiplied production, sending bombers and fighters across the Atlantic. Farmers grew wheat and corn that crossed the sea to feed allies. The scale was staggering. By the end of the war, America would produce 2/3 of all the munitions used by the Allies. More planes, more ships, more vehicles than any other nation could imagine. Imagine the roar of a Detroit assembly line in 1942. Workers moved swiftly, welding armor plates, fitting engines, attaching treads. Where once shiny cars rolled out for city streets, now Sherman tanks emerged, their turrets gleaming under factory lights. Outside, trains waited to carry them to ports, where ships would carry them across oceans. In another plant, women riveted wings onto bombers, their hair tied back with scarves, their hands steady on drills. Rosie the Riveter became an icon, symbolizing how millions of women stepped into roles once barred to them, keeping production flowing while men fought abroad. The numbers alone tell the story. America built nearly 300,000 planes, more than 100,000 tanks, and 2.6 million machine guns. It produced enough cargo ships to create whole fleets from scratch, replacing losses faster than German submarines could sink them. Jeep after Jeep rolled out, lightweight, reliable, and indispensable, earning the nickname the vehicle that won the war. From Liberty ships to long-range bombers, From bullets to boots, the flow seemed endless. No other nation could match this torrent. This industrial miracle was possible because of decisions made long before. The engines of growth built in the 19th century, the immigrant labor that filled factories, the infrastructure of railroads and ports, the financial institutions of Wall Street, all of it came together in a vast mobilization. Geography added its blessing once again. America's homeland was safe from bombing raids that crippled factories in Europe and Asia. Its plants ran day and night, without fear of Luftwaffe attacks or artillery shells. While London endured the Blitz and Soviet cities burned, America's cities glowed with production. But the arsenal of democracy was more than machines. It was also a unifying spirit. Communities gathered scrap metal, children collected rubber, families planted victory gardens. Posters urged citizens to conserve, to ration, to give. Bonds were sold in enormous campaigns, financing the war effort. Movies and radio programs blended entertainment with encouragement, reminding people that every sacrifice at home helped soldiers abroad. The entire society was mobilized, not just the military. The Lend-Lease Act, passed in 1941, embodied this role. It allowed the United States to supply allies with weapons, food, and materials, even before it formally entered the war. Billions of dollars worth of supplies flowed to Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and others. Crates of ammunition, convoys of trucks, shipments of wheat and canned meat, they carried American strength across oceans. The United States was not yet firing on the front lines, but it was already shaping the outcome. Then came December 7, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor ended any illusion of distance. The United States was thrust fully into war. But by then, the arsenal was already humming. The transition from peace to war was not a desperate scramble, but a rapid acceleration of systems already in motion. The factories simply shifted into higher gear. The shipyards built faster, the people gave more. What had begun as aid to others became preparation for America's own armies, navies, and air forces. Within months, millions of men were in uniform. They were trained, equipped, and supplied not only by government orders, but by the collective effort of society. Each soldier carried a rifle made in an American plant, rode in trucks built in Detroit, ate food canned in Midwestern factories. Each ship sailed with steel forged in Pittsburgh. Each plane flew with engines designed in Ohio or California. The arsenal was not an abstract concept. It was the literal lifeline of the war effort. On battlefields across the globe, the presence of American industry was unmistakable. In North Africa, convoys of jeeps gave mobility to Allied forces. In the skies over Europe, squadrons of American-built bombers darkened the horizon. In the Pacific, aircraft carriers launched waves of planes, supported by fleets of destroyers and supply ships that seemed inexhaustible. Wherever the Allies advanced, American factories had left their imprint. Even the enemies recognized it. German and Japanese leaders understood that defeating the United States was not only about defeating its armies, but about outlasting its production. Yet the flow never stopped. Submarines sank ships, but new ones replaced them. Bombers were shot down, but factories produced more. Tanks were lost in battles, but replacements arrived in endless columns. The industrial depth of the United States was too vast to overcome. The war effort also transformed American society. Women, African Americans, and other minorities found new roles, proving their ability and resilience in industries and services once denied to them. The war did not erase inequalities, but it shifted perceptions and opened doors that would fuel social movements in the decades ahead. Migration patterns changed as people moved to cities where war jobs were plentiful, reshaping demographics and laying foundations for future growth. Economically, the war ended the Depression once and for all. Factories ran at full capacity, unemployment plummeted, wages rose. Government spending, massive and unprecedented, poured money into research and development. Radar, jet engines, and early computers were born of wartime needs. Scientific and technological progress accelerated at a pace few had imagined. The arsenal of democracy was not only producing weapons for the present but laying the groundwork for the innovations of the future. When victory came in 1945, the world looked very different. Europe lay in ruins, its cities shattered, its economies exhausted. Japan was devastated, its industries destroyed. The Soviet Union had endured staggering losses, its land scarred by invasion. Only the United States stood with its homeland untouched, its factories stronger than ever, its wealth multiplied. In 4 years, the arsenal of democracy had not only supplied a war but positioned America as the undisputed economic and military leader of the free world. Picture the contrast. In Berlin, rubble stretches as far as the eye can see, buildings reduced to shells, people queuing for scraps of food. In London, gaps remain where bombs destroyed entire neighborhoods. In Hiroshima, shadows are etched into walls where people once stood. And across the ocean, in Chicago or Los Angeles, factories are already shifting back to peacetime production, churning out cars, appliances, and homes for returning soldiers. The difference is stark. Geography had shielded America, and industry had elevated it. The legacy of this role would define the coming century. Allies remembered that America's supplies had sustained them in their darkest hours. Enemies knew they had been overwhelmed by production as much as by soldiers. The world understood that in any future conflict, the United States had the capacity to arm itself and its partners faster than any rival. This knowledge alone was a form of power. The arsenal of democracy was more than a wartime slogan. It was a turning point in history, the moment when America's industrial might fused with moral purpose. It showed that the United States could not only defend itself but sustain others, not only fight but rebuild. It revealed the full potential of a nation whose land, people, and ingenuity had been building toward this moment for generations. And when the war ended, that potential did not fade. It became the foundation of America's global superpower status in the world that followed. Part 10. The Atomic Age. The Second World War ended with thunder unlike anything the world had ever known. In August of 1945, 2 Japanese cities were erased in moments, their skies lit by a blinding flash, their streets turned to ash. Hiroshima and Nagasaki marked not only the end of a terrible conflict, but the beginning of an entirely new age. For the first time in history, a single bomb carried the force of an entire fleet of aircraft, the destruction of an entire city, the promise of annihilation on a scale previously unimaginable. And the nation that wielded it, the United States, suddenly possessed a weapon that changed the balance of power for all humanity. The atomic bomb was not an accident of fortune. It was the culmination of an enormous scientific and industrial mobilization known as the Manhattan Project. Beginning in secrecy in 1942, this project drew upon the greatest minds of physics, chemistry, and engineering. Albert Einstein's warning to Roosevelt that Germany might be pursuing such a weapon gave urgency to the effort. From universities to hidden laboratories, from Chicago to Los Alamos, thousands worked in silence, building reactors, refining uranium, and designing a weapon that combined theory with terrifying practicality. The scale was immense. Entire towns sprang up in Tennessee and Washington, their residents sworn to secrecy. Trains carried ore, reactors split atoms, factories refined fissile material. In the deserts of New Mexico, The first bomb was tested at Trinity in July 1945. Those who witnessed it spoke of a light brighter than the sun, a shockwave that rolled across the land, and a silence that followed, filled with awe and dread. With that detonation, humanity had crossed a threshold it could never retreat from. When the bombs were dropped on Japan, the message was unmistakable. The United States now possessed not only industrial might, not only vast armies and navies, but also the ultimate weapon. It was both a tool of war and a symbol of supremacy. No other nation had it. For 4 years after 1945, the United States held a monopoly on nuclear weapons, and in those years, its influence was unmatched. The atomic age transformed America's global position. Suddenly, military power was measured not only in tanks and planes, but in warheads. Diplomacy shifted. Allies looked to the United States for protection, believing its nuclear umbrella would shield them from aggression. Rivals hesitated, knowing that direct conflict risked annihilation. The United States, already elevated by geography, industry, and war, now stood alone with a weapon that made it untouchable. But the atomic bomb was not merely a military advantage. It was also a scientific and cultural shock. For ordinary Americans, it introduced a mix of pride and fear. Newspapers hailed victory, but people also imagined cities vaporized in an instant. Children learned to duck and cover. Families built fallout shelters. The same weapon that had ended war also introduced a constant shadow of future destruction. The scientific breakthroughs of the Manhattan Project also laid the groundwork for other fields. Nuclear energy promised new sources of power. Advances in physics, engineering, and computing accelerated research across disciplines. The atomic age was not only about bombs, but about the expansion of human knowledge, driven by urgency, fear, and ambition. Geography again played a role. Only a nation as vast as the United States could have hosted the sprawling facilities needed for such a project. Its universities, laboratories, and industries provided fertile ground for collaboration. Its wealth funded the unprecedented expense. Its safety, shielded from bombing, allowed uninterrupted progress. The atomic bomb was in some ways inevitable, but it was no accident that America was the first to succeed. As the Cold War began, the monopoly ended. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its own atomic bomb, shocking the United States and beginning a nuclear arms race that would last decades. The brief period of unrivaled power gave way to a balance of terror. Yet even then, America retained an advantage. Its arsenal was larger, its delivery systems more advanced, its resources more abundant. The bomb remained a cornerstone of American power, shaping strategy, alliances, and global politics. The atomic age also altered America's sense of responsibility. Possessing the power to destroy civilization imposed a burden. Leaders debated doctrines of deterrence, containment, and defense. Citizens grappled with the paradox of peace built on the threat of annihilation. Culture reflected this tension. Films, literature, and art captured both the wonder of science and the dread of destruction. Consider the scene of an American family in the early 1950s. In their suburban home, they gather around a radio as news breaks of another Soviet test. The father glances at the newspaper, filled with diagrams of mushroom clouds. The mother stocks canned goods in a basement corner, where a fallout shelter has been dug. The children, just returned from school, repeat drills of hiding under desks. Outside, jets streak across the sky, symbols of both protection and potential doom. This was the texture of life in the atomic age, prosperity and anxiety intertwined. Internationally, the bomb reinforced America's role as leader of the Western world. Nations in Europe, devastated by war and wary of Soviet expansion, looked to Washington for guarantees. NATO, formed in 1949, was underpinned by the promise that American nuclear weapons would deter aggression. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe with dollars, while the nuclear shield reassured it with protection. Economic aid and atomic deterrence worked together, weaving America into the very fabric of global security. At the same time, America invested heavily in research and technology, ensuring that it stayed ahead. The hydrogen bomb, tested in 1952, unleashed power far beyond Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Intercontinental ballistic missiles soon followed, capable of delivering destruction across continents. Each innovation deepened the sense that America's destiny was tied to science, that its power rested not only on land and people but on knowledge itself. The atomic age was therefore a paradox. It elevated the United States to heights of influence no other nation had reached, yet it also introduced vulnerabilities. The same weapons that guaranteed safety also threatened mutual destruction once others acquired them. The glow of mushroom clouds was both a symbol of supremacy and a reminder of fragility. Power had never been greater, but neither had risk. Still, in the immediate years after 1945, the United States stood alone. Its monopoly, though brief, gave it confidence, influence, and prestige. Its scientists were admired, its military respected, its culture exported. The bomb was more than a weapon. It was a signal that America was the nation of the future, the place where science, industry, and power converged. When we ask why the United States became a global superpower, the atomic age is impossible to ignore. It was the moment when America's material and intellectual capacities combined to create something transformative. It was the proof that the nation could mobilize resources, harness science, and change history. And though others would catch up, the legacy of being first remained. Thus, the atomic age was not just a chapter in the story of American power. It was a milestone that reshaped the world itself. It marked the beginning of an era in which the United States would lead, not only with armies and industries, but with the very forces of the atom. For better and for worse, that leadership defined the second half of the 20th century, and it remains etched in the memory of all who lived in its shadow. Part 11. The Dollar Rules. When the guns of the Second World War finally fell silent in 1945, the world lay in ruins. Cities were gutted, railways twisted, fields scarred, economies shattered. From London to Leningrad, from Warsaw to Tokyo, nations faced the daunting task of rebuilding not just homes and factories, but currencies, banks, and markets. Amid this devastation, one nation stood tall, its homeland untouched, its industry booming, its wealth greater than any in history. The United States, protected by oceans and powered by wartime production, now held the financial keys to the future. More than armies or bombs, it was the dollar that would cement America's place as a global superpower. The foundation of this new order had already been laid before the war even ended. In July 1944, as Allied forces pushed toward victory, representatives from 44 nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their task was monumental: to design a financial system that could stabilize the world after the chaos of depression and war. For weeks, delegates debated exchange rates, currencies, and institutions. At the heart of it all stood the American dollar. The agreement they reached, known simply as the Bretton Woods system, created a new architecture for global finance. The US dollar would become the central currency, fixed to gold at $35 an ounce. Other nations would peg their currencies to the dollar, using it as the anchor of stability. Alongside this arrangement, two new institutions were born: the International Monetary Fund, to provide short-term loans and oversee currency stability, and the World Bank to fund reconstruction and development. In practice, it meant that global trade and finance would flow through Washington and New York, with the dollar as its bloodstream. This was not an accident. The United States controlled nearly 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. Its economy accounted for almost half of global production. Its banks were strong, its currency trusted, its government stable. No other nation could have taken this role, even if they had wanted to. Britain was exhausted, its empire fraying. France was shattered. Germany and Japan were occupied. The Soviet Union was powerful militarily but isolated economically. Only the United States had the strength, the wealth, and the credibility to anchor the system. The consequences were profound. As trade resumed, dollars became the lubricant of global commerce. Ships carrying wheat from Kansas, cars from Detroit, or machines from Pittsburgh were not just selling goods, they were spreading the reach of the dollar. Banks in Europe and Asia needed dollars to finance trade, companies needed dollars to settle accounts, and governments needed dollars to stabilize currencies. Soon, the greenback was everywhere. In the tills of Parisian shops, in the vaults of Tokyo banks, in the reserves of Latin American governments. Imagine a French merchant in 1950 importing American tractors to plow fields still scarred by war. Payment is made not in francs but in dollars. Or picture a Japanese company buying steel from the United States to rebuild its factories. The invoice, again, is in dollars. Across the globe, nations that once relied on gold or their own currencies now depended on the dollar as the measure of value, the medium of exchange, and the store of trust. This financial dominance gave the United States extraordinary power. With dollars in demand everywhere, America could run deficits without the same fear that haunted other nations. If it needed to spend more, on defense, on foreign aid, on investments, it could simply issue more dollars, knowing they would be accepted abroad. In effect, the world was financing America's ambitions, willingly holding its currency as the foundation of stability. It also gave Washington leverage. When allies needed loans or aid, America provided them, often with conditions that aligned with its policies. When adversaries sought to undermine the system, America could use financial tools, restrictions, sanctions, withholding of dollars, to apply pressure without firing a shot. The dollar was not just money. It was a strategic weapon. The Marshall Plan exemplified this new reality. Announced in 1947, it poured over $13 billion, more than $150 billion in today's terms, into the reconstruction of Western Europe. The funds rebuilt factories, repaired infrastructure, and restored trade. But the money was in dollars, meaning that European economies became tied to American markets, American banks, and American policy. Goods bought with Marshall Plan aid often came from American companies, further boosting U.S. industry. The plan was both an act of generosity and an assertion of economic leadership. For ordinary Americans, this financial supremacy brought a period of prosperity unmatched in history. Returning soldiers used the GI Bill to attend college and buy homes. Suburbs spread outward from cities, filled with new houses, cars, and appliances. Wages rose, consumption soared, and the American dream became a lived reality for millions. Underpinning it all was a global system in which the dollar reigned supreme, giving America cheap imports, eager markets, and stable finance. The contrast with other nations was stark. Britain struggled with debt and decolonization. France fought to stabilize its Fourth Republic. Germany and Japan, though soon to recover rapidly, began the post-war era as devastated lands under occupation. The Soviet Union offered an alternative model, promoting communism and ruble-based trade among its satellite states, but its closed system could not compete with the openness and flexibility of the dollar-based order. For most of the world, the choice was clear. The dollar was the currency of stability, prosperity, and the future. This system also encouraged American culture to spread. Movies, music, fashion, and consumer goods traveled along the same routes as dollars. To use American money was, in a sense, to touch American life. The Coca-Cola bottle, the Hollywood film reel, the jazz record, and later the rock album became symbols of the same influence that carried the greenback. Economic dominance fused with cultural dominance, reinforcing each other in a cycle that extended America's reach far beyond trade. The financial supremacy of the United States did not mean a world without challenges. Inflation at home, trade imbalances, and political opposition abroad tested the system. Yet for decades after 1945, the dollar held firm. Even when crises struck, as with Britain's struggles in 1947 or France's in the 1950s, the solution often came through American loans, American aid, or American support. Each crisis reaffirmed dependence on the dollar rather than weakening it. The symbolism of this dominance could be seen in the vaults of central banks. Where once gold bars had been the ultimate sign of wealth, now stacks of US Treasury bonds and reserves of green currency served as the cornerstone of stability. Governments measured their health not only by their own finances but by how many dollars they held. The phrase "as good as gold" slowly gave way to "as good as the dollar." Picture a bustling port in 1955, perhaps in Rotterdam or Yokohama. Ships unload crates marked "Made in USA," filled with machinery, vehicles, or wheat. Dock workers are paid in local currency, but the transaction behind it all is denominated in dollars. In offices above the port, accountants calculate profits in dollars, banks issue loans in dollars, and governments track reserves in dollars. The daily hum of global commerce, from the docks to the banks, is tuned to the rhythm of American money. This supremacy extended to finance in ways often invisible to the public. Wall Street became the center of global capital. If a company in Latin America wanted to raise funds, it often looked to New York investors. If a European government needed loans, it sought American banks. Insurance, investment, shipping, and trade, all tied, directly or indirectly, to the dollar. Behind every exchange was the assumption that the United States would remain stable, its currency reliable, its economy dominant. In this way, financial power complemented military and political power. The United States built alliances, stationed troops, and projected strength across the globe. But it was the dollar that ensured these efforts were sustainable. Armies require funding, bases require supplies, and allies require aid. With the dollar at the center of global finance, America could provide all three more easily than any rival. The dollar also gave America resilience in the Cold War. While the Soviet Union spent heavily on its military, it lacked a currency trusted beyond its borders. Its economic influence was confined to its sphere, and even there, shortages and inefficiencies undermined it. The United States, by contrast, could borrow from the world, invest abroad, and use its currency to knit together a vast network of allies and partners. The Cold War was fought with tanks and missiles, but it was also fought with banks and bonds, and in that contest, the dollar was decisive. When we ask why the United States became a superpower, the story of the dollar is essential. Military victories and scientific breakthroughs mattered, but it was the financial order built at Bretton Woods, sustained by American strength, and spread through global trade that anchored the superpower role. The dollar became more than paper and ink. It became the world's measure of value, the world's medium of trust. And so, in the years after World War II, as nations rebuilt and commerce revived, the heartbeat of global trade was not in London, Paris, or Berlin, but in Washington and New York. Every exchange, every investment, every reserve whispered the same truth. The age of the dollar had begun, and with it, the age of American supremacy. Part 12. The Cold War Contest. When the Second World War ended, two nations stood taller than the rest. The United States, its homeland untouched and its economy booming, and the Soviet Union, blooded but victorious, with armies stretching deep into Europe. Between them lay the wreckage of old empires. Britain weakened, France scarred, Germany divided, Japan in ruins. The world that emerged from 1945 was not one of many powers, but of two great rivals. One represented democracy, capitalism, and the dollar. The other claimed socialism, revolution, and the red banner of communism. Their rivalry defined the age, shaping every continent, every alliance, every hope and fear. For the United States, the Cold War was not only a challenge but an opportunity. By contesting the Soviet Union, it solidified its own role as a global superpower. The tension began almost immediately. At Yalta and Potsdam, Allied leaders argued over the future of Europe. The Soviet Union installed friendly governments in Eastern Europe, turning them into satellite states. Winston Churchill soon spoke of an Iron Curtain descending across the continent. To the west, nations looked to Washington for support, fearing that without American aid they might fall under Soviet influence. For the first time, the United States found itself not retreating into isolation but building a network of alliances. President Harry Truman set the tone in 1947. The Truman Doctrine declared that the United States would support free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. In practice, it meant that America would oppose Soviet expansion wherever it appeared. Soon after came the Marshall Plan, pouring billions of dollars into rebuilding Western Europe. This was more than generosity. It was strategy. Prosperous nations would be less vulnerable to communism, and their recovery tied them firmly to the American economic system. Dollars and aid became weapons as powerful as armies. At the same time, military alliances formed. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, bound the United States, Canada, and Western Europe together in collective defense. An attack on one would be an attack on all. This formalized America's role as protector of the West, stationing troops, weapons, and eventually nuclear arms across the Atlantic. The Soviet Union responded with its own alliance, the Warsaw Pact, drawing a sharp line across Europe. Two armed camps now faced each other, their arsenals growing, their soldiers waiting. The Cold War was not fought like traditional wars, but through 1,000 contests across the globe. In Greece, in Turkey, in Korea, in Vietnam, the United States and the Soviet Union backed opposing sides. The Korean War in the early 1950s was the first test. When North Korea, supported by Moscow and Beijing, invaded the South, America led a United Nations coalition to push them back. The war was brutal, fought in mud and snow, ending in stalemate. Yet it signaled that America would not hesitate to fight abroad to contain communism. Nuclear weapons loomed over every decision. After 1949, when the Soviet Union detonated its own atomic bomb, the monopoly ended. By the 1950s, both sides possessed hydrogen bombs capable of unimaginable destruction. Strategies of deterrence emerged. Mutually assured destruction meant that neither side could strike without inviting its own annihilation. It was a grim balance, yet it prevented direct war. Instead, the contest unfolded in shadows, in proxy wars, in espionage, in space, in culture. Espionage was a defining feature. Spies moved silently through embassies and back alleys, stealing secrets, planting moles, decoding signals. The CIA in the United States and the KGB in the Soviet Union became symbols of intrigue, each playing a dangerous game of hidden moves. At home, fear of espionage fueled suspicion. In America, the era of McCarthyism saw accusations of communist infiltration spread through government and culture. The Cold War was fought not only abroad but in the minds of citizens, where loyalty and ideology were questioned daily. Technology became another battleground. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. Its beeping signal shocked the United States, proving that Moscow could reach into space and perhaps deliver warheads across continents. America responded with the space race, pouring money into science and education. NASA was born, rockets were built, astronauts trained. In 1969, when Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon, it was more than exploration. It was a demonstration that American innovation and determination could surpass its rival. Culture, too, was part of the contest. American jazz, Hollywood films, and consumer goods flowed across borders, symbols of freedom and prosperity. Soviet art and propaganda offered visions of equality and strength under socialism. Radio broadcasts carried competing messages across the Iron Curtain. The Cold War was not only about tanks and missiles but about ideas, lifestyles, and dreams. Which system could deliver not just survival, but a better life? For many, the glow of American abundance, the cars and refrigerators and blue jeans, became irresistible. The Cold War also expanded America's reach beyond Europe. In Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, the United States sought allies and influence. Sometimes this meant aid and investment. Sometimes it meant covert action, coups, or military intervention. The logic of containment often pushed America into conflicts far from its shores, each justified as a necessary stand against communism. Some of these actions strengthened alliances, others sowed resentment. Yet they all reinforced the reality that America was now engaged in every corner of the globe. At home, the Cold War reshaped society. The fear of nuclear war led to drills in schools, sirens in cities, shelters in basements. Defense spending soared, fueling industries in aerospace, electronics, and research. Highways were built partly with military mobility in mind. Suburbs expanded, symbolizing both prosperity and security. The federal government invested in universities and science, ensuring that America remained ahead in technology. The competition with the Soviet Union permeated daily life, binding the nation to its global role. Crises punctuated the tension. The Berlin airlift of 1948–49, when American planes delivered supplies to a city blockaded by the Soviets, proved America's resolve. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, with American ships enforcing a blockade as Soviet missiles were withdrawn. Each confrontation revealed both the danger and the necessity of America's global engagement. Retreat was not an option. Leadership was the price of survival. Yet the Cold War was not only fear and rivalry. It also spurred achievements that reshaped the world. The race for science produced vaccines, satellites, computers, and space exploration. The competition pushed both sides to new frontiers of knowledge. For America, the benefits were profound: technological dominance, innovation-driven growth, and a culture that celebrated progress. The very rivalry that threatened annihilation also accelerated advancement. By the 1970s and 1980s, the Cold War had lasted for a generation. New strategies emerged: détente, arms control treaties, moments of cooperation alongside renewed rivalry. Through it all, the United States maintained its alliances, sustained its economy, and continued projecting influence. The Soviet Union, burdened by inefficiency and repression, struggled to match America's flexibility and wealth. The contest was long, costly, and dangerous, but it cemented the role of the United States as the indispensable nation in the global order. When we look back, the Cold War was more than a conflict. It was the framework of an era. It gave America a mission: to defend freedom, to contain communism, to lead allies. It required investment in military, science, and diplomacy. It demanded resilience at home and presence abroad. And through it all, it affirmed that the United States was not only a participant in history but its shaper. Thus, the Cold War contest was not merely a struggle with the Soviet Union. It was the crucible in which America's superpower status was tested, challenged, and confirmed. It forced the nation to build alliances, to sustain innovation, to wield both hard power and soft power. And when the contest finally ended, the United States emerged not just I. Part 13. Soft Power and Culture. Military strength and economic might explained much of America's rise, but they were not the only sources of influence. Power is not only about armies, factories, and gold reserves. Sometimes it comes more quietly, carried in stories, music, images, and dreams. After 1945, as the United States grew into its role as a global superpower, its culture, its way of life, its art, its technology, its consumer goods, spread across borders with a force as decisive as tanks or treaties. This was America's soft power, the ability to shape what people desired, admired, and believed, not through coercion but through attraction. The story began with film. Hollywood had been a thriving industry since the 1920s, but after the Second World War its reach expanded dramatically. While European studios struggled to rebuild, American films poured into theaters around the world. Westerns, musicals, comedies, and dramas filled screens in Paris, Tokyo, Buenos Aires, and Cairo. Actors like Humphrey Bogart, Marilyn Monroe, and James Dean became global icons. To watch an American film was to glimpse a world of glamour, freedom, and abundance. Even in nations skeptical of US politics, audiences lined up for Hollywood movies. The imagery was irresistible: fast cars, wide streets, confident heroes, and endings where problems were solved and futures seemed hopeful. Music carried the same influence. Jazz, born in African American communities, had already crossed the Atlantic in the interwar years. After the war, it flourished as a symbol of improvisation, freedom, and modernity. In smoky clubs from Berlin to Tokyo, young people swayed to the sounds of trumpets and saxophones, hearing in the rhythms a defiance of rigid order. Later, rock and roll erupted in the 1950s, with Elvis Presley shaking stages and radios crackling with rebellious energy. The music was raw, loud, and different from anything Europe or Asia had known. It spoke directly to youth, bridging languages through rhythm. By the 1960s, the Beatles and other British bands would respond with their own styles, but even that wave was built on the foundation of American sound. Soft power flowed not only in art but in consumer goods. Coca-Cola, once a regional soft drink, became a global symbol. The red and white logo appeared in markets from Latin America to Asia, its taste associated with modernity and American lifestyle. Jeans, once work clothes, became fashion statements worldwide. Fast food chains spread hamburgers and fries into foreign cities, changing diets and routines. American cars, radios, and appliances became objects of aspiration. To own them was to feel connected to the energy of the United States. Technology amplified this effect. In the post-war decades, American inventions reshaped daily life everywhere. Television spread American shows into foreign living rooms. NASA's space achievements, the Mercury missions, the Gemini program, the Apollo moon landing, were broadcast across the globe, symbols of American ingenuity. A child in Africa or Asia, gazing at a grainy screen, could see men walking on the moon under the American flag. The achievement was not only scientific but cultural, planting the idea that America led humanity into the future. Education and ideas carried influence too. American universities welcomed foreign students, many of whom returned home to lead in politics, science, and business. Books, journals, and later computer technology spread through global networks dominated by American companies. The English language itself became more widespread, accelerated by the dominance of American media and academia. To succeed in business or science, it became increasingly necessary to learn the language of American power. Soft power also functioned in contrast. In the Cold War, the Soviet Union offered an alternative vision, disciplined, collective, and ideological. Yet the imagery that most people saw of America was more enticing. The wide highways, the supermarkets with rows of goods, the suburban houses with lawns, the movies filled with humor and romance. These contrasted sharply with shortages, queues, and gray apartment blocks in many communist nations. Even where America's politics were distrusted, its lifestyle was admired. Young people in Eastern Europe secretly listened to jazz records or tried to wear blue jeans, tiny acts of rebellion fueled by American culture. The reach of soft power was not only about what people consumed but what they imagined. The American dream, the belief that anyone could rise through hard work, became a myth that traveled far beyond US borders. Immigrants carried stories back to their homelands. Soldiers who had fought alongside Americans spoke of their wealth and optimism. Tourists returned with photographs of wide streets and neon lights. Even propaganda could not erase the appeal. Consider a young man in post-war Italy. His town has been bombed. His family struggles to find work. At the local cinema, he watches an American film filled with laughter, music, and modern cars. For 2 hours, he sees a different world, not grey rubble but bright lights. Or imagine a teenager in Poland in the 1970s, tuning a radio late at night to catch forbidden rock music. The sound is faint, interrupted by static, but it carries a sense of connection to something freer, larger, more alive. These moments may seem small, but multiplied across millions, they shaped perceptions of America as more than a country, as an idea. Of course, soft power was not without contradictions. American culture sometimes sparked backlash, criticized as shallow, materialistic, or imperialistic. Intellectuals in Europe warned of colonization, the fear that American products would overwhelm local traditions. Governments in Asia and Africa sometimes resisted what they saw as cultural dominance. Yet even in criticism, the influence was undeniable. To debate American culture was to acknowledge its presence, its reach. Soft power also intertwined with diplomacy. The Peace Corps, founded in 1961, sent young Americans abroad to work in villages and towns, building schools, digging wells, teaching languages. These volunteers embodied a vision of service, contrasting with images of war or intervention. Exchange programs brought foreign students to America, where they experienced its openness and carried memories home. Sometimes these experiences created lifelong goodwill, shaping how leaders abroad thought of the United States. During the Cold War, this cultural influence was a strategic asset. While Soviet tanks stood ready in Eastern Europe, it was often American music, movies, and consumer goods that eroded the loyalty of youth to the communist system. No amount of propaganda could fully block the appeal of jeans, rock music, or Hollywood. The Berlin Wall could stop people from leaving, but it could not stop ideas, fashions, or songs from crossing. By the 1980s, this cultural edge mattered as much as nuclear arsenals. At home, Americans did not always recognize the power of their culture abroad. For many, Coca-Cola or movies were simply ordinary parts of life. Yet abroad, they symbolized abundance and possibility. A simple advertisement on a billboard in a distant city could carry more weight than a diplomatic speech. A rock concert could inspire more hope than a summit meeting. Soft power was woven into the daily fabric of life in ways that hard power could never achieve. The strength of soft power also lay in its continuity. Governments changed, policies shifted, but culture remained. Even in times when America's politics drew criticism, during wars, during controversies, the allure of its culture endured. People might protest its foreign policy, but still line up for its movies, crave its music, and adopt its fashions. Soft power was resilient because it was not only imposed, it was desired. When we ask why the United States became a global superpower, culture and soft power must be part of the answer. Military and economic might built the framework, but it was the spread of ideas, dreams, and images that filled it with substance. Hard power could force obedience, but soft power invited admiration. Together, they created a superpower not only feared, but followed. And so, in the decades after 1945, the world did not only hear America's voice through speeches or commands. It heard it in the laughter of movie theaters, the beats of music, the fizz of a soda bottle, the crackle of a radio, the images of a man walking on the moon. It heard it in the soft echoes of desire, curiosity, and inspiration. This was America's quiet empire, not of colonies, but of culture, and it became one of the strongest pillars of its global dominance. Part 14. The End of Rivals. For nearly half a century, the Cold War had defined the world. Two superpowers faced each other across oceans and continents, each armed with nuclear arsenals capable of ending civilization, each determined to outlast the other. The United States and the Soviet Union fought proxy wars, raced into space, built alliances, and spread influence into every corner of the globe. To many, it seemed the rivalry would last forever, an endless contest between capitalism and communism. But by the final decade of the 20th century, the struggle came to an unexpected conclusion. One superpower fell. The other stood alone. And in that moment, the United States entered a new age, no longer balanced by rivals but commanding the world stage as the sole superpower. The cracks in the Soviet Union had been forming for years. Beneath the surface of parades and slogans lay stagnation. Factories produced, but inefficiency was rampant. Central planning strained under the weight of a modern economy. Shortages became common, bread lines lengthened, store shelves emptied, promises of abundance rang hollow. Meanwhile, the United States surged ahead in technology, finance, and innovation. Personal computers, satellites, and global corporations expanded America's lead. Where Soviet citizens queued for basic goods, Americans filled shopping malls and drove highways in new cars. The contrast was glaring, and it mattered. Military competition had also taken its toll. To match the United States, the Soviet Union poured vast resources into weapons and armies. Nuclear arsenals grew, tanks filled Eastern Europe, submarines prowled beneath the seas. But the costs were immense. While America's economy could sustain both defense and prosperity, the Soviet system strained under the burden. Guns came at the expense of butter, missiles at the expense of modern housing and consumer goods. The people felt the weight of sacrifice, but the rewards were few. The 1980s sharpened this imbalance. In the United States, under Ronald Reagan, military spending soared. New programs promised advanced missiles, stealth aircraft, and even space-based defense systems. The so-called Strategic Defense Initiative, dubbed Star Wars, captured imaginations, even if its feasibility was uncertain. To Soviet leaders, it signaled that America's technological lead might render their nuclear arsenal obsolete. To match it seemed impossible. To ignore it seemed dangerous. The pressure mounted. At the same time, internal reforms in the Soviet Union tried to address the crisis. Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power in 1985 with a vision of change. His policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, aimed to modernize the system, reduce censorship, and introduce elements of market reform. For a moment, it seemed a new era might emerge, one of cooperation rather than confrontation. Arms control agreements were signed, summits held, tensions eased. Yet openness revealed problems that had long been hidden: corruption, inefficiency, dissent. Instead of saving the system, reform accelerated its unraveling. In Eastern Europe, the effects were immediate. For decades, Soviet tanks had guaranteed control. But by the late 1980s, resistance movements grew stronger. In Poland, the Solidarity movement challenged communist rule. In Hungary, reforms opened borders. In East Germany, crowds gathered at the Berlin Wall, demanding freedom. When the wall finally fell in 1989, the world watched in astonishment. Families embraced, hammers chipped at concrete, music and laughter filled the air where soldiers once patrolled. The Cold War's most visible symbol had collapsed in a single night, and with it, the illusion of Soviet permanence. The dominoes fell quickly. One by one, Eastern European regimes crumbled, choosing reform, democracy, or independence. The Soviet Union itself, a patchwork of republics held together by force and ideology, began to fracture. Nationalist movements surged in the Baltics, in Ukraine, in Central Asia. The center could no longer hold. In 1991, after a failed coup by hardliners, the Soviet Union dissolved. The red flag was lowered over the Kremlin, replaced by the tricolor of Russia. An empire had ended not with a nuclear war, but with quiet resignation. For the United States, the moment was unprecedented. After decades of rivalry, it suddenly found itself without a peer competitor. The unipolar moment, as some called it, had arrived. America's military was unmatched, its economy dominant, its culture pervasive, its dollar supreme. NATO remained strong, the European Union grew, but both looked to Washington for leadership. China was rising, but not yet a global force. Russia struggled with chaos and decline. The world had not seen such singular power since the height of Rome. Imagine a scene in 1992, in a cafe in Paris. Patrons sip coffee, reading newspapers filled with headlines about the Soviet collapse. In the same pages, advertisements for American movies, American jeans, and American fast food franchises line the margins. Across the Atlantic, in Washington, policymakers debate how to use this moment, whether to expand NATO, to spread democracy, to reshape the world order. Ordinary Americans, meanwhile, watch the news with relief. The long shadow of nuclear confrontation seemed to lift. Children no longer practiced drills in schools. The fear of annihilation eased, replaced by confidence that the future belonged to them. The Gulf War of 1991 reinforced this perception. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, the United States assembled a vast coalition, launched precision airstrikes, and in weeks expelled the occupiers. The war demonstrated not only America's military superiority but also its ability to lead alliances. Satellites, stealth bombers, cruise missiles, all showcased a technological edge few could imagine. The world saw what it meant to be a superpower in the post-Cold War era. Not just strength, but coordination, speed, and overwhelming capacity. Culturally, The collapse of the Soviet Union unleashed a flood of American influence into places once closed. McDonald's opened in Moscow, drawing long lines as Russians tasted a symbol of Western life. American films filled new theaters, American music played on radios, American products appeared in stores. For millions who had lived under restrictions, the allure was irresistible. The Cold War had been as much about ideas as weapons, and in the end, American ideas proved more durable. Yet victory brought questions. With the rival gone, what was America's purpose? Containment had guided foreign policy for decades. Now, with no empire to contain, debates raged. Some argued for a peace dividend, reducing military spending, focusing inward. Others saw an opportunity to expand democracy, to shape a global order aligned with American values. The 1990s became a decade of experimentation, with interventions in the Balkans, peace efforts in the Middle East, and expansion of NATO eastward. The United States, for better or worse, was the world's central actor. The end of rivals also carried risks. Without balance, responsibility grew heavier. Allies sometimes resented dependence, adversaries sought new ways to challenge dominance, and within America itself, overconfidence sometimes led to missteps. But in the early years after the Cold War, the overall impression was clear: the United States had won. It had endured depression, fought world wars, stood firm in the Cold War, and emerged not just surviving, but supreme. When we ask why the United States became a global superpower, the collapse of the Soviet Union marks the final confirmation. All the elements, geography, industry, innovation, military might, culture, and finance, had built toward this moment. The fall of its greatest rival left the United States not only powerful but unrivaled. The 20th century closed with a single superpower standing, its influence spanning continents, its presence felt in every capital, every market, every cultural space. And so, in 1991, as the red flag came down over Moscow, the world entered a new era. The Cold War was over. The age of American dominance had begun in full. The United States, no longer one of two, was now the one. The end of rivals was not just a geopolitical event, but a defining chapter in the story of how America became the global superpower. Part 15. The American Century. By the close of the 20th century, the United States stood in a position no other nation had ever fully achieved. It had survived depression and civil strife, fought 2 world wars, faced down nuclear confrontation, and emerged as the last great power standing. Journalists, historians, and politicians called it the American century, not only because of what the nation had accomplished, but because of the ways it had shaped the very framework of global life. To understand why America became the superpower of the modern era, one must look back at all the forces that converged to create its dominance, and then forward to the meaning of that dominance for the world. The story begins with geography. Oceans shielded the United States from the devastation that scarred Europe and Asia. Fertile plains, abundant rivers, coal, oil, and timber gave it resources unmatched. Its position on the map, isolated from rivals yet connected to 2 vast oceans, allowed it to grow strong before others could interfere. Safety gave it time, and resources gave it tools. Few nations ever enjoyed such blessings from the land itself. Next came the engines of growth. The Industrial Revolution in America unleashed steel mills, railroads, oil refineries, and assembly lines. From Pittsburgh smokestacks to Detroit's factories, from Chicago's slaughterhouses to New York's financial towers, industry roared. By 1900, America's economy was already the largest in the world. Immigrant labor fueled the boom, bringing hands and minds from every corner of the globe. Together, They built a society that was not only productive but also innovative, constantly pushing boundaries. The Gilded Age revealed both the promise and the peril of this new wealth. Corporations and financiers amassed fortunes that rivaled kingdoms, laying the foundations for global finance in New York. Railroads and infrastructure stitched the nation together, while conflicts between labor and capital forged reforms. Out of inequality and turbulence came resilience, systems, and institutions that prepared the United States for the demands of global leadership. The first steps abroad signaled a turning point. With the Spanish-American War, the annexation of territories, and the construction of the Panama Canal, the United States planted its flag far beyond its borders. For the first time, it thought of itself not only as a continental nation but as an oceanic one, with bases, markets, and interests around the globe. This was the prelude to deeper engagement in world affairs. World War I was the debut. America entered late but decisively, tipping the balance with fresh troops and supplies. Its president, Woodrow Wilson, even arrived at the peace conference with a vision of global order. Though the nation retreated afterward into isolation, the world had seen its power. America could cross oceans, mobilize industry, and shape outcomes. The seed of superpower status was planted. The years between the wars tested the nation's resilience. The exuberance of the Roaring Twenties revealed its dynamism, while the Great Depression revealed its fragility. Yet democracy endured, adapting through Roosevelt's New Deal, proving that the system could bend without breaking. This resilience became part of America's strength, the ability to reinvent itself even in crisis. World War II was the crucible. While Europe and Asia burned, America's homeland remained intact, its factories churning out weapons, ships, and planes on an unprecedented scale. By 1945, the United States was producing more than the rest of the world combined. Its soldiers fought across continents, its scientists built the atomic bomb, its economy ended the Depression and surged forward. When the war ended, every major industrial rival lay in ruins. America stood unscathed, powerful, and indispensable. The atomic age amplified this dominance. Possessing nuclear weapons first, and later maintaining a technological edge, the United States held a kind of ultimate power. It was both a shield and a burden, deterring conflict while imposing responsibility. At the same time, American investment in science, research, and technology positioned it at the forefront of innovation. The glow of mushroom clouds was terrifying, but it also signaled that America was a nation whose knowledge had reached into the deepest secrets of the universe. Finance and the dollar anchored its supremacy. The Bretton Woods system made the U.S. currency the cornerstone of global trade. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe with American funds. Wall Street became the center of global capital, and dollars flowed everywhere, into reserves, into markets, into daily transactions. Economic dominance was not only about exports, it was about trust. The world trusted the dollar, and by extension, trusted American stability. The Cold War was the long contest that tested all these foundations. Against the Soviet Union, the United States deployed not just armies and bombs, but ideas, alliances, and culture. NATO secured Europe. The Truman Doctrine and containment strategy projected American resolve into distant lands. Wars in Korea and Vietnam, crises in Berlin and Cuba, rivalries in Africa and Asia, all revealed the strain of global responsibility. Yet the United States endured, constantly adapting, innovating, and expanding its influence. Culture proved to be as powerful as armies. Hollywood films, jazz, rock and roll, blue jeans, fast food, and television all carried an image of American life, sometimes idealized, sometimes criticized, but always magnetic. People who distrusted American foreign policy still lined up for its movies, craved its music, and admired its consumer goods. The soft power of attraction undercut the rigidity of communist ideology, offering a vision of abundance and freedom that proved difficult to resist. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States found itself without rivals. The Berlin Wall fell, the red flag came down, and the Cold War ended without the nuclear catastrophe so long feared. America's military remained unrivaled, its economy dominant, its culture pervasive. In the 1990s, interventions in the Middle East and the Balkans showed its ability to assemble coalitions and deploy overwhelming force. The unipolar moment, as scholars called it, marked the peak of American supremacy. All these threads, geography, industry, immigration, finance, war, culture, and resilience, wove together into the fabric of American superpower. None alone would have sufficed, but together they created a nation whose influence reached every continent, every economy, every imagination. By the dawn of the 21st century, America's presence was so pervasive that it was hard to imagine a world without it. And yet, the story of the American century is not only one of dominance but also of consequence. With power came responsibility, to lead alliances, to defend order, to manage crises. Sometimes that responsibility was met with wisdom, sometimes with hubris. Allies sometimes felt secure, sometimes resentful. Adversaries sometimes respected, sometimes resisted. Soft power could attract, but hard power could provoke. The paradox of superpower status was always this: the same reach that built influence also brought scrutiny. Imagine a classroom in a small African city in 1995. Children learn English from books donated by American programs. On the teacher's desk sits a radio that plays American pop songs. The chalk they use comes from a factory financed by foreign aid. Down the road, a clinic funded by an American NGO provides vaccines. The United States is not physically present with armies or rulers, but its influence shapes daily life. Or picture a street in Moscow that same year, where McDonald's draws long lines. The Cold War has ended, but the symbols of American culture are everywhere, filling spaces once reserved for ideology. These are the subtle echoes of superpower. When we ask why the United States became the global superpower, the answer is not simple, nor is it one-dimensional. It is not only about wealth, or bombs, or culture, but about the convergence of all these elements in one place, in one time, on one land blessed with opportunity and inhabited by a people willing to seize it. Other nations have been rich. Other nations have been powerful. But rarely has one combined so many advantages with such determination. Thus the American century was not declared, it was lived. It unfolded through wars and recoveries, through inventions and music, through treaties and rivalries. It was not always gentle, not always just, not always admired. But it was decisive. It shaped the architecture of finance, the alliances of defense, the flow of culture, the trajectory of science. And though no century lasts forever, the imprint of America on the 20th remains as deep as Rome's on the ancient world. As night falls on this story, we see the arc clearly. A young republic, once cautious and distant, grew through geography, industry, immigration, and struggle into a nation that could not be ignored. Wars thrust it outward, crises tested it, rivals sharpened it, culture carried it. By the century's end, it stood as the defining power of its age. Whether praised or criticized, admired or resisted, its role was undeniable. The American century was the culmination of a long journey, and the clearest answer to the question of how the United States became a global superpower.